The day I turned 28, my father looked me straight in the eye and called me the biggest burden he'd ever carried. 3 months later, I sold our family mansion for $12 million and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a deed to an abandoned military base and a note that would change everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Victoria Sterling, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who end up needing you the most. Growing up in the Sterling household meant living under the shadow of impossible expectations. Our family mansion sat on 40 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, complete with manicured gardens, a tennis court, and enough rooms to house a small army. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American success story. My father, Richard Sterling, had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming abandoned lots into luxury shopping centers across the Northeast. My mother, Margaret, played the role of the devoted wife, hosting charity galas and managing our household staff with military precision. But behind those pristine white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges, our family was anything but perfect. I was an only child, which meant every ounce of my parents' attention fell squarely on my shoulders. While other kids my age were playing with friends or exploring hobbies, I was shuttled between piano lessons, French tutoring, and etiquette classes. My father had grand plans for me to join the family business, eventually taking over his empire when he retired. The problem was, I had absolutely no interest in real estate development. My passion lay in environmental science. I spent my teenage years sneaking out to local nature preserves, documenting wildlife and studying ecosystems. When I announced my intention to major in environmental studies at college, my father's reaction was swift and brutal. He threatened to cut off my tuition unless I switched to business. I compromised, double majoring in both subjects, thinking I could somehow bridge the gap between my interests and his expectations. College was my sanctuary. For 4 years, I lived in a dorm room smaller than my walk-in closet back home, and I'd never been happier. I made friends who knew nothing about my family's wealth, worked part-time jobs at the campus greenhouse, and threw myself into research projects studying the impact of urban development on local wildlife habitats. My professors encouraged my work, and I even published a paper on sustainable building practices that garnered attention from several environmental organizations. But all good things must come to an end. The day I graduated, my father was waiting in the parking lot with a brand new BMW and a job offer I couldn't refuse. Well, technically I could refuse, but doing so would mean being disowned entirely. So I found myself back home, sitting in a corner office at Sterling Development, wearing designer suits that felt like costumes and pretending to care about profit margins and zoning regulations. The next 6 years were a masterclass in slow-motion suffocation. Every morning I'd wake up in my childhood bedroom, now redecorated in what my mother called sophisticated adult tones, and drive to work alongside my father. He'd spend the entire commute pointing out properties he was considering for development, most of which happened to be the exact kind of natural habitats I'd studied in college. It was like being forced to watch someone systematically destroy everything you loved, one bulldozer at a time. My father's management style could best be described as dictatorial. He micromanaged every aspect of my work, from the color of my business cards to the way I answered the phone. Nothing I did was ever good enough. If I closed a deal, he'd criticize my negotiation tactics. If I brought in a new client, he'd question their financial stability. If I suggested incorporating sustainable building practices into our developments, he'd lecture me about the bottom line and remind me that tree-hugger nonsense had no place in serious business. The worst part wasn't the constant criticism. It was the way he'd dismiss my ideas in front of colleagues and clients. During board meetings, he'd interrupt my presentations to clarify my points, essentially rewriting everything I'd said. He'd introduce me to potential investors as my daughter who's still learning the ropes, even though I'd been working there for years and had a master's degree in business administration. But I endured it all because I believed that eventually things would change. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, proved myself enough times, he'd finally see me as a capable adult rather than a disappointment. I told myself that once I gained his respect, I'd be able to influence the company's direction, maybe even introduce some environmentally conscious practices. That delusion came crashing down on my 28th birthday. The day started normally enough. I arrived at the office early, as usual, and spent the morning reviewing contracts for a new shopping center project. Around lunchtime, my father called me into his office. I expected him to wish me a happy birthday, maybe even suggest we go out for dinner to celebrate. Instead, he closed the door and gestured for me to sit down with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded bad news. "Victoria," he began, settling into his leather chair behind the mahogany desk that dominated the room, "I've been thinking about your future with this company." My heart skipped a beat. Was he finally ready to promote me? Give me more responsibility? I'd been hoping for this conversation for years. "I've been patient with you," he continued, his voice taking on that familiar lecturing tone. "More patient than I should have been, frankly. But I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room." I waited, confused about where this was heading. "You're not cut out for this business, Victoria. You never have been. Every day, you come in here going through the motions, but your heart isn't in it. You don't have the killer instinct that real estate development requires. You're too soft, too concerned with feelings and environmental impact reports, and all that liberal nonsense they filled your head with in college." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to stay composed. "Dad, I've been working here for 6 years. I've brought in millions of dollars in revenue. He held up a hand to silence me. "You've done adequate work, I'll give you that. But adequate isn't good enough in this business. You need to be ruthless. You need to be willing to do whatever it takes to close a deal, even if it means stepping on a few toes along the way. And you're just not that person." I felt my cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time you found your own path. Something more suited to your temperament. Maybe you could work for one of those environmental groups you're always talking about. I'm sure they'd appreciate your bleeding heart approach." The dismissive way he said environmental groups made it clear what he thought of my interests, but I wasn't ready to give up. "Dad, I think you're underestimating me. Give me a chance to prove myself. Let me lead the Morrison project. I have some ideas that could—" "Victoria," his voice was sharp now, cutting through my protest. "You're 28 years old. You've had 6 years to prove yourself, and frankly, you've failed. You're not partner material. You're not even senior associate material. You're a burden." The word hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. A burden. After everything I'd sacrificed, all the dreams I'd given up, all the years I'd spent trying to be the daughter he wanted, he saw me as nothing more than a burden. "I've been carrying you for too long," he continued, apparently oblivious to the devastation his words were causing. "It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. I'm giving you a severance package, a generous one, considering your performance, and I think it would be best if you cleaned out your office today." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My father, the man who had raised me, who had paid for my education, who had supposedly loved me, had just fired me on my birthday and called me a burden in the same breath. "The severance package will give you time to figure out your next steps," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I've already spoken to your mother about this. She agrees that it's for the best." Of course she did. My mother had never once stood up to my father, never once taken my side in any argument. She was the perfect corporate wife, agreeing with everything he said and maintaining the family image at all costs. Hell, I picked up the folder with shaking hands and stood up. "Is that all?" "Victoria, this isn't personal. It's business. You'll understand when you're older." The condescending tone was the final straw. I was 28 years old, had 2 college degrees, and had been working in his company for 6 years. But he was still treating me like a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the adult world. I walked out of his office in a daze, past the secretary who wouldn't make eye contact, past the colleagues who suddenly seemed very interested in their computer screens, and into my own office. It took me less than an hour to pack up my personal belongings. A few photos, some books, and a small plant that had somehow survived the sterile corporate environment. That evening, my parents hosted their annual birthday dinner for me. It was a tradition they'd maintained since I was a child, though it had always been more about showing off to their friends than actually celebrating me. This year, the guest list included the usual suspects: other wealthy families from our country club, a few business associates, and some family friends who'd known me since I was in diapers. My mother had outdone herself with the decorations. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine, with elaborate floral arrangements and her finest china. She'd hired a caterer, of course, and the meal was restaurant quality. Everyone commented on how lovely everything looked, how thoughtful my parents were, how lucky I was to have such a wonderful family. Ahas! If only they knew the truth. Ah. Throughout the dinner, I smiled and made polite conversation, playing the role of the grateful daughter. Nobody mentioned the fact that I'd been fired that morning. My father acted as though nothing had happened, regaling the guests with stories about his latest business deals and accepting congratulations on his success. But I could see the way he looked at me when he thought nobody was watching. There was no warmth in his eyes, no paternal pride, just disappointment and, worst of all, pity. He pitied me. His own daughter was nothing more than a failed experiment, a disappointment he'd finally decided to cut loose. After the guests left, and the caterers had cleaned up, I found myself alone in the mansion's library. It was my favorite room in the house, lined floor to ceiling with books, and furnished with comfortable leather chairs that actually showed signs of use. I'd spent countless hours in that room as a child, reading everything from classic literature to field guides about local wildlife. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. That night, I sat in the wingback chair by the window and tried to figure out what to do next. The severance package was generous, enough to support me for at least a year while I figured out my next move. But money wasn't the issue. The issue was that I felt completely lost. For 6 years, I'd defined myself by my job at Sterling Development, even though I'd hated every minute of it. Before that, I'd been a student, working toward the goal of joining the family business. I'd spent my entire adult life following a path that had been laid out for me, and now that path had abruptly ended. More than that, I felt betrayed. Not just by my father, but by myself. I'd spent so many years trying to earn his approval, compromising my own values and interests in the process. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone who wore expensive suits and talked about profit margins, while secretly mourning every tree that got cut down for another strip mall. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. Maybe being fired was actually a blessing in disguise. Maybe it was the push I needed to finally start living my own life instead of the one my father had planned for me. I spent the day researching environmental organizations, looking for job opportunities that would allow me to use my education in a meaningful way. There were several possibilities: a nonprofit focused on preserving wetlands, a consulting firm that helped companies reduce their environmental impact, even a government position with the EPA. For the first time in years, I felt excited about the future. That excitement lasted exactly 3 days. On Thursday morning, I was sitting in the kitchen having breakfast when my mother walked in, already dressed for her morning tennis lesson. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me, wearing the kind of serious expression that usually preceded an uncomfortable conversation. "Victoria," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate precision, "your father and I have been talking about your situation." I braced myself for another lecture about my failures and shortcomings. "We're concerned about you," she continued. "You've been moping around the house for days, and, frankly, it's becoming a bit depressing. We think it might be best if you found somewhere else to live while you figure out your next steps." I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "You want me to move out?" "Well, you're 28 years old, dear. Most people your age don't live with their parents. And now that you're not working for the company anymore, it seems like a good time for you to establish your independence." The word independence sounded strange coming from her mouth. She'd never worked a day in her life, had never paid her own bills or made her own financial decisions. Her entire identity was built around being Richard Sterling's wife, and now she was lecturing me about independence. Besides, she added, your father needs to focus on the business, and having you here is, well, it's a distraction. There it was again. I wasn't just a burden to my father, I was a distraction too. My very presence in the house was somehow interfering with his ability to run his company. How long do I have? I asked, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. We were thinking the end of the month would be reasonable. That gives you 2 weeks to find something suitable. 2 weeks. 28 years of living in this house, and I got 2 weeks' notice to find somewhere else to go. That afternoon, I drove around town looking at apartments. Everything I saw was either too expensive, or too small, or too far from anywhere I might want to work. I'd gotten used to living in a mansion with 40 acres of privacy, and the prospect of sharing walls with strangers in a cramped apartment complex felt suffocating. But more than that, I was angry. Furious, actually. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how unfair the entire situation was. My father had spent years undermining my confidence, dismissing my ideas, and treating me like an incompetent child. And now, just when I was finally ready to break free and start my own life, he was kicking me out of the house as if I were some kind of freeloader. The final straw came that weekend, when I overheard my parents talking in the garden. I had been walking back from the tennis court when I heard voices coming from the rose garden. I probably should have announced my presence, but something in their tone made me stop and listen. I think we handled that very well, my mother was saying. Victoria needed a wake-up call. And sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. It wasn't about being cruel, my father replied. It was about being realistic. She was never going to make it in business, and keeping her on was hurting the company. I have a responsibility to my employees and investors. Still, calling her a burden might have been a bit harsh. Margaret, she needed to hear the truth. She's been coasting on my reputation for years, and it was time someone told her that she wasn't measuring up. Maybe now she'll finally grow up and take responsibility for her own life. I stood there behind the hedge, listening to them discuss my shortcomings as if I were a failed business venture they were trying to liquidate. The casual way they talked about my pain, as if it were a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, made me feel physically sick. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Via? I'd been thinking about my grandmother's will for weeks, ever since the conversation with my father. My paternal grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind a considerable estate that included not just money, but also some unusual properties. Most of her wealth had gone to my father, as expected, but she'd left me something specific. A piece of land in upstate New York that had once been a military training facility. At the time, I'd thought it was an odd bequest. The property was miles from anywhere, completely undeveloped, and came with some kind of restriction about what could be built on it. My father had dismissed it as worthless, saying the military had probably contaminated the soil and left behind all sorts of environmental hazards. But my grandmother had been very specific in her will that the land was meant for me and me alone. I'd never bothered to visit the property or even research it properly. But now, sitting in my childhood bedroom after overhearing my parents' conversation, I found myself wondering if there was more to my grandmother's gift than I'd realized. The next morning, I called the lawyer who had handled my grandmother's estate. Robert Chen was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had been the family's attorney for decades. He seemed surprised to hear from me but agreed to meet for lunch to discuss the military base property. Your grandmother was very specific about that land, he told me over sandwiches at a quiet restaurant downtown. She made me promise that you'd be the sole owner, with no interference from your father. She seemed to think it would be important to you someday. What exactly is on the property? I asked. It's about 200 acres of mostly wooded land with some old military buildings. The base was decommissioned in the 1980s, and the government sold it to private investors. Your grandmother bought it in the 1990s, though I never knew why. She visited it a few times over the years but never developed it. He handed me a manila folder containing the deed and some old photographs of the property. The images showed dense forest broken up by a few concrete buildings and what looked like old training facilities. It wasn't much to look at, but something about it appealed to me. There's one more thing, Robert said, lowering his voice. Your grandmother left a sealed letter for you. with instructions that it should only be given to you if you ever asked about the property specifically. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. I opened it carefully, aware that this might be the last communication I'd ever receive from her. The letter was brief but revealing. My dear Victoria, if you're reading this, it means you've finally asked about the military base. I always hoped you would, though I suspected it might take some kind of crisis to make you curious enough. The land is yours to do with as you see fit, but I hope you'll see it for what it really is, a sanctuary. When your grandfather and I were first married, we used to dream about having a place where we could escape from the pressures of society and just be ourselves. This property represents that dream. Your father will never understand the value of something that can't be monetized, but I think you will. You have your grandfather's heart and your own strong spirit. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not capable of great things. The land is wild and beautiful, and it's waiting for someone who will appreciate it for what it is, rather than what it could be turned into. I think that someone is you. With all my love, Grandmother Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times before I fully understood what she was trying to tell me. The military base wasn't just a piece of property, it was a message, a reminder that I didn't have to live the life my father had planned for me. I could choose something different, something that aligned with my own values and interests. That afternoon, I drove upstate to see the property for myself. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until I reached a rusted gate with a private property sign. I used the key Robert had given me to unlock the gate, and drove down a dirt road that wound through dense forest. The first thing that struck me was the silence. After years of living in a house where every conversation was carefully managed, and every emotion was suppressed, the natural quiet of the forest felt like a benediction. I could hear birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the distant sound of running water. The old military buildings were exactly as they'd appeared in the photographs, concrete structures that had been built for function rather than beauty. But they were solid and weatherproof, and with some work, they could be converted into something livable. More importantly, the land itself was spectacular. 200 acres of mixed forest, with a small stream running through the middle and several natural clearings that would be perfect for wildlife observation. I spent the entire afternoon walking the property, and by the time I headed back to Connecticut, I knew what I was going to do. The drive back to Connecticut felt like crossing into enemy territory. Every mile brought me closer to a life I no longer wanted, a house that had never truly felt like home, and parents who saw me as nothing more than a disappointment to be managed. But something had shifted during those hours walking through the forest. For the first time in years, I felt like I had options. Real options. Not just the carefully curated choices my father had presented to me throughout my life. When I arrived home that evening, my parents were hosting a dinner party for some potential investors. I could hear laughter and conversation drifting from the dining room as I slipped upstairs to my room. The sound of their voices, so animated and cheerful, stood in stark contrast to the cold dismissal I'd experienced just days earlier. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, determined to research every aspect of the military base property. What I discovered over the next few hours exceeded my wildest expectations. The land wasn't just beautiful, it was ecologically significant. The property contained several rare plant species, served as a migration corridor for local wildlife, and included a pristine watershed that fed into a larger river system. More importantly, I found records indicating that the military had conducted minimal environmental damage during their occupation. Unlike many former military sites, this one had been used primarily for training exercises rather than weapons testing or chemical storage. The soil and water tests from the 1980s showed no contamination, which meant the land was perfect for conservation purposes. By 3 a.m, I had a complete picture of what I was dealing with. The property was worth far more than my father had assumed, not in terms of development potential, but as a pristine natural habitat. Several environmental organizations had actually tried to purchase similar properties in the region, offering substantial sums for land preservation. That's when the idea hit me. I spent the next 2 days crafting a plan that would accomplish 3 things. Give me the financial independence I needed, allow me to pursue meaningful work in environmental conservation, and send a message to my father that would be impossible to ignore. The first step was getting the mansion appraised. I called 3 different real estate firms, pretending to be conducting research for a potential family trust. The estimates were consistent. Our family home was worth between $11 and $13 million, depending on market conditions. The 40 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, combined with the mansion's historical significance and luxury amenities, made it one of the most valuable properties in the county. Next, I researched the legal requirements for selling the property. This was where things got complicated. While the house was titled in my father's name, I discovered something interesting in the family trust documents. My grandmother had structured the family finances in a way that gave me partial ownership of several properties, including the mansion, upon reaching age 25. The ownership had transferred automatically 3 years earlier, but apparently no one had bothered to inform me. According to the trust documents, I owned 30% of the mansion, with my father holding 50% and my mother holding 20%. More importantly, the trust included a clause that allowed any owner to force a sale if they could demonstrate that maintaining the property was no longer financially viable for them personally. I spent an entire day with Robert Chen, going through the legal implications of this discovery. He confirmed that I had the right to force a sale of the mansion, though doing so would undoubtedly create a family crisis of epic proportions. "Are you sure you want to do this, Victoria?" he asked, peering at me over his reading glasses. "This kind of action tends to burn bridges permanently." "The bridges are already burned," I replied. "I'm just making it official." The next phase of my plan involved finding the right buyer. I needed someone who could move quickly and had the financial resources to purchase the property without lengthy negotiations. After some research, I found exactly what I was looking for: a luxury property development firm that specialized in converting historic mansions into boutique hotels and event venues. The firm, Prestige Properties, had been looking for a property exactly like ours for over a year. They wanted something with historical significance, plenty of land for parking and events, and a location within reasonable driving distance of New York City. Our mansion checked every box. I arranged a meeting with their acquisition team, presenting myself as a family representative, exploring options for the property. They were immediately interested, especially when I mentioned that the property might be available for quick sale due to family circumstances. Within a week, I had a formal offer: $12 million, with a 60-day closing period and minimal contingencies. The offer was contingent on clear title, but given the property's condition and location, Prestige Properties was willing to move forward with very little due diligence. Now came the difficult part: telling my parents. I chose a Sunday morning when they were both home and relatively relaxed. My father was reading the newspaper in his study, and my mother was arranging flowers in the sunroom. I asked them to meet me in the living room, saying I had something important to discuss. They settled into their usual seats, my father in his leather recliner, my mother on the sofa, with the kind of patient expressions people wear when they're expecting to hear something mildly inconvenient. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, addressing my father directly, "about how I need to learn to stand on my own feet and take responsibility for my own life." He nodded approvingly. "Good. I'm glad you're finally seeing sense. I've decided you're absolutely right. I do need to be independent, and I need to stop being a burden to this family." My mother smiled encouragingly. "We're proud of you for recognizing that, dear." "So I'm selling the mansion." The words landed like a bomb in the peaceful morning silence. My father's newspaper crumpled in his hands, and my mother's face went completely white. "What did you say?" my father asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm selling the mansion. I have a buyer lined up and we can close in 60 days. My share of the proceeds will give me enough money to start my own life, just like you wanted." "Victoria, you can't sell the mansion," my mother said, her voice rising in panic. "This is our home. We've lived here for 30 years. "Actually, I can," I replied, pulling out the folder of legal documents Robert had prepared. "According to Grandmother Eleanor's trust, I own 30% of this property. And according to the trust terms, I have the right to force a sale if maintaining the property is no longer financially viable for me. My father stood up abruptly, his face turning red. "You can't be serious. This is our family home. Your home." "No, Dad. You made it very clear that this isn't my home anymore. You gave me 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live, remember? You called me a burden and fired me from the family business. So I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. I'm taking responsibility for my own life." "But you can't just sell the house out from under us," my mother protested. "Where will we live?" "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said, echoing the dismissive tone my father had used with me so many times. "You're both successful adults. I have confidence in your ability to adapt." My father began pacing back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous. You're being childish and vindictive. We'll fight this in court." "You can try," I said calmly. "But Robert Chen has already reviewed the legal documents, and he's confident that I have the right to force this sale. You can spend money on lawyers if you want, but it will just delay the inevitable and cost you more in the long run." "Victoria, please," my mother said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "You're upset about what happened with the company, but this is extreme. We can work something out." "What kind of workout did you have in mind?" I asked. "Are you going to give me my job back? Are you going to apologize for calling me a burden? Are you going to treat me like an adult instead of a failed experiment?" My father stopped pacing and looked at me with pure fury. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" "Everything you've done for me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean like paying for my education so I could work in your company for 6 years making less than your secretary? Or like providing me with a home that you kicked me out of the moment I became inconvenient?" "We invested in your future," he said through gritted teeth. "We gave you opportunities that most people can only dream of." "You gave me a cage," I shot back. "A very expensive, very pretty cage, but a cage nonetheless. And the moment I showed any signs of wanting something different, you decided I was defective and needed to be discarded." The argument continued for another hour, with my parents alternately pleading, threatening, and trying to guilt me into changing my mind. But I'd made my decision, and nothing they said was going to alter it. Finally, my father played his last card. "If you do this, you're no longer my daughter. You'll be dead to me." "Good," I replied. "That will make this much easier for both of us." I left them in the living room and went upstairs to pack. I'd already arranged to stay in a hotel for the next few weeks while the sale proceeded, and I wanted to collect my personal belongings before things got even more hostile. As I was loading boxes into my car, I could hear my parents on the phone, frantically calling lawyers and trying to find a way to stop the sale. But I knew they wouldn't succeed. Robert had been thorough in his research, and the trust documents were ironclad. 3 days later, I drove back to the military base property with a contractor I'd hired to assess the buildings. The old barracks could be converted into a comfortable living space, and the other structures could be transformed into research facilities and workshop areas. The contractor estimated that the renovations would cost about $200,000, a fraction of what I'd received from the mansion sale. While the contractor took measurements and made notes, I walked through the forest, planning how I would use the land. Part of it would remain completely wild, serving as a sanctuary for local wildlife. Other areas could be developed for research purposes, with minimal environmental impact. I envisioned building a small cabin near the stream, where I could live simply and focus on the work I was truly passionate about. The best part was the silence. No phones ringing, no meetings to attend, no father criticizing my every move. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the gentle babbling of the stream. Over the next few weeks, the mansion sale proceeded smoothly. Prestige Properties was true to their word, moving quickly through the due diligence process and securing financing. My parents tried several legal maneuvers to stop the sale, but each attempt was quickly defeated by the solid foundation of the trust documents. The most satisfying moment came when my father's lawyer called Robert to discuss a potential settlement. Apparently, my parents were willing to offer me a substantial sum of money to withdraw the sale and allow them to keep the mansion. The offer was generous, more than $1 million, but I turned it down without hesitation. "It's not about the money," I told Robert. "It's about the principle. They need to understand that actions have consequences. And they can't just throw money at problems to make them go away. As the closing date approached, my parents made one final attempt to change my mind. They invited me to lunch at an expensive restaurant, the kind of place where they'd taken me for special occasions throughout my childhood. I agreed to meet them, curious to see what they would say. The conversation was awkward from the start. My mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and my father looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. They talked about family traditions and shared memories, trying to appeal to my emotions. "This house has been in our family for 30 years, my mother said. It's where you took your first steps, where you had your birthday parties, where you graduated from high school. How can you just throw all of that away?" "I'm not throwing it away," I replied. "I'm moving on. There's a difference." "But we're your family," she protested. "Families stick together, even when things get difficult." "You should have thought of that before you decided I was a burden," I said quietly. "You should have thought of that before you kicked me out of my own home." My father leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used with difficult clients. "Victoria, I admit that I handled things poorly. I was under a lot of pressure with the business, and I said some things I shouldn't have said. But we can work this out. We can find a way to move forward as a family." "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "Come back to the company. I'll give you a senior position, real responsibility. We'll work together as partners, not as father and daughter, but as business associates." I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. But all I saw was desperation and the same manipulative charm he'd used my entire life to get his way. "And what happens the next time we disagree about something?" I asked. "The next time you think I'm not meeting your expectations? Will you fire me again? Call me a burden again?" "That won't happen," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're right," I agreed. "It won't happen. Because I'm done working for you. I'm done trying to earn your approval. I'm done being your daughter." I left the restaurant without looking back, knowing that it was probably the last time I'd ever see my parents. The realization should have been devastating, but instead I felt lighter than I had in years. The closing took place on a rainy Thursday morning in October. I sat in the lawyer's office, signing document after document, officially severing my ties to the family mansion and everything it represented. When the final papers were signed and the check was deposited into my account, I felt like I was finally free. My parents didn't attend the closing, but they sent their lawyer a letter. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was from my father, and it was brief. "Victoria, I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. You've destroyed our family over a petty disagreement, and I'll never forgive you for that. Your mother is heartbroken, and I'm disappointed beyond words. You think you've won something, but you've actually lost everything that matters. Money won't replace the family you've thrown away, and you'll regret this decision for the rest of your life. Don't bother trying to contact us. As far as we're concerned, you no longer exist. Richard Sterling." I read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it in my purse. Someday, I thought, I might want to remember exactly how he'd reacted when I finally stood up for myself. That afternoon, I drove to the military base with a truck full of my belongings. The contractors had finished the basic renovations, and the old barracks had been transformed into a comfortable living space. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I spent the evening unpacking and arranging my furniture, creating a home that reflected my own tastes rather than some designer's vision of what a wealthy family should want. I hung my environmental science degree on the wall, set up my books on shelves made from reclaimed wood, and placed my grandmother's letter in a frame on my desk. As the sun set over the forest, I sat on my new front porch with a cup of tea and thought about what came next. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, even if I never worked again. But more importantly, I had the freedom to choose work that mattered to me. I'd already been in contact with several environmental organizations, and there was significant interest in using the military base as a research facility. The property's unique ecosystem and pristine condition made it perfect for long-term wildlife studies and conservation projects. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do. The cost had been high. I'd lost my family, my childhood home, and any chance of reconciliation with my parents. But I'd gained something far more valuable: myself. That night, I slept better than I had in years, lulled by the sound of owls calling through the forest and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. I was finally home. The first winter at the military base tested every assumption I'd made about my new life. November brought unseasonable cold, and I quickly learned that living in a converted barracks was vastly different from inhabiting a climate-controlled mansion. The heating system was functional but hardly luxurious, and I found myself wearing wool sweaters indoors and drinking endless cups of hot tea to stay warm. But strangely, I loved every challenging moment of it. For the first time in my adult life, every problem I faced was mine to solve. When the pipes froze during a particularly brutal cold snap, I didn't call a maintenance crew. I learned how to thaw them myself. When a family of raccoons took up residence in one of the unused buildings, I researched humane removal methods and spent days carefully relocating them to a more suitable habitat deeper in the forest. Each small victory felt monumental after years of having decisions made for me by parents who assumed I was incapable of handling real-world challenges. By spring, I'd established routines that would have been incomprehensible to my former self. I woke with the sunrise, not because an alarm forced me awake, but because the natural light filtering through my bedroom windows made artificial schedules unnecessary. I spent mornings walking the property boundaries, cataloging wildlife sightings, and documenting seasonal changes in the forest ecosystem. The afternoons were devoted to the research facility I was developing in partnership with the Hudson Valley Conservation Alliance. The organization had been thrilled to learn about my property and its potential for long-term ecological studies. Dr. Sarah Whitman, the Alliance's research director, had visited in February and immediately recognized the scientific value of having an undisturbed forest ecosystem available for comprehensive study. This kind of pristine habitat is incredibly rare, she'd explained during her tour of the property. Most forests in this region have been logged or developed at some point in the past century. Your property appears to have been largely untouched, which makes it invaluable for understanding what these ecosystems looked like before widespread human intervention. The partnership we developed was exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd dreamed about during those miserable years at Sterling Development. The Alliance provided scientific expertise and research funding, while I offered the property and my own environmental science background. Together, we were creating something that would benefit wildlife conservation efforts throughout the region. But the project that gave me the most satisfaction was completely unexpected. In May, I received a phone call from Jessica Torres, a social worker with the state's Youth Services Department. She'd heard about my property through the Conservation Alliance and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration. We work with teenagers who've aged out of the foster care system, she explained during our initial meeting. Many of them have had difficult experiences with traditional family structures and need time to develop independent living skills before they're ready for college or full-time employment. She proposed using part of my property as a transitional living program, where young adults could live in small cabins while participating in environmental education and job training programs. The idea was to combine practical life skills with meaningful work in conservation and sustainable living. These kids have often been told their problems to be managed, Jessica said. What they need is a chance to prove to themselves that they're capable of creating something positive. Her words struck a chord that resonated deeply with my own experience. I immediately agreed to explore the possibility. And by summer, we had plans for a pilot program that would house 6 young adults in newly constructed eco-friendly cabins scattered throughout the property. The first residents arrived in September. Marcus, 19, who'd spent most of his teenage years bouncing between group homes. Elena, 18, who'd been emancipated from an abusive family situation. David, 20, who'd struggled with addiction after aging out of foster care. Aisha, 19, who'd been homeless for 6 months after leaving her last placement. Jordan, 18, who identified as non-binary and had been rejected by multiple foster families. And Sam, 21, who had developed. Each of them carried stories of abandonment, disappointment, and adults who had failed them in fundamental ways. But they also brought curiosity, resilience, and a hunger for genuine connection that reminded me why I'd chosen this path. Working with them became the most rewarding experience of my life. We developed the property together, building hiking trails, creating wildlife observation blinds, and establishing sustainable gardens that provided fresh food for the community. The research station expanded to include educational programs where the residents could learn about local ecology while contributing to ongoing scientific studies. Marcus discovered a talent for carpentry and began crafting furniture from fallen trees we cleared from hiking trails. Elena, who had never shown interest in academics during her turbulent school years, became fascinated with botanical illustration and started documenting the plant species we encountered during our forest surveys. David channeled his energy into maintaining the property's network of walking trails, creating a comprehensive system that served both our research needs and the therapeutic hiking program Jessica had developed. Aisha surprised everyone, including herself, by developing a passion for wildlife photography. Her images of birds, deer, and smaller forest creatures began attracting attention from nature magazines and conservation organizations. Jordan found their calling in sustainable agriculture, transforming a small clearing into a productive organic garden that supplied vegetables for our entire community. Sam, despite his developmental challenges, became our unofficial weather forecaster, displaying an almost supernatural ability to predict storms and seasonal changes. Watching these young people discover their capabilities and develop confidence was like witnessing flowers bloom in fast forward. But more than that, it helped me understand something crucial about my own journey. The real tragedy of my relationship with my father wasn't that he'd called me a burden or fired me from his company. The tragedy was that he'd never seen my potential, never recognized that my different perspective might actually be an asset rather than a liability. He'd been so focused on molding me into his image of success that he'd completely missed who I actually was and what I might accomplish if given the freedom to follow my own path. The irony became even more apparent as news of my project began spreading through environmental and social work circles. By the end of our first year, I was receiving inquiries from researchers, educators, and youth advocates from across the country. The model we'd developed, combining conservation work with transitional housing for vulnerable young adults, was being hailed as innovative and effective. Articles about our program appeared in several professional journals, and I was invited to speak at conferences about sustainable community development and alternative approaches to youth services. The same qualities my father had dismissed as weaknesses. My concern for environmental impact, my interest in helping people rather than maximizing profits, my preference for collaboration over competition were exactly what made our project successful. But perhaps the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. In December, almost exactly 1 year after I'd left the mansion, I received a call from Robert Chen. He'd been contacted by a journalist writing an article about innovative environmental projects in the Northeast, and she'd asked him for background information about my property purchase and conservation work. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride I'd never heard before. "I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone make such a dramatic positive change in their life circumstances. What you've built out there is remarkable." He paused, then added something that caught me off guard. "Your father called me last week." My stomach tightened involuntarily. I hadn't heard anything about my parents since the closing, and I'd assumed they were content to pretend I no longer existed. "He wanted to know if there was any legal way to reverse the property sale," Robert continued. "Apparently, they've been having financial difficulties since moving out of the mansion." This revelation was startling. My father had always presented himself as financially invincible, someone who had so much money that losing the mansion would be merely inconvenient rather than catastrophic. "What kind of difficulties?" I asked, despite myself. "Without the mansion as collateral, he's been unable to secure financing for some major development projects. The real estate market has been challenging, and several deals have fallen through. He's had to lay off employees and scale back operations significantly." Robert's tone was carefully neutral, but I could sense there was more to the story. "There's something else," he said. "He asked me to contact you about the possibility of reconciliation. He said he's willing to discuss bringing you back into the family business." I almost laughed out loud. After a year of silence, after declaring me dead to him, my father was suddenly interested in reconciliation because his business was struggling. The transparent self-interest of it was almost insulting. "What did you tell him?" I asked. I told him that any communication would have to go through me, and that I wouldn't even mention it to you unless you specifically asked about your family. But since you brought up the subject, I thought you should know. I thought about it for several days before responding. Part of me was curious about what my father would say, what kind of apology or explanation he might offer. But a larger part of me recognized that nothing he could say would change the fundamental dynamic between us. He'd only reached out because he needed something from me, not because he'd genuinely realized he'd been wrong. If his business recovered, if he found other sources of financing, he'd go right back to treating me as an expendable disappointment. That wasn't the foundation for a healthy relationship, and I'd worked too hard to build a life I loved to risk destroying it for someone who'd only value me when I was useful to him. I called Robert back and told him I wasn't interested in any contact with my father. He seemed unsurprised by my decision. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're making the right choice. Sometimes the best thing you can do for toxic family members is to maintain healthy boundaries, even if it means staying away entirely." That conversation marked a turning point in how I thought about my parents and my decision to leave. For months, I'd carried a quiet guilt about destroying their comfortable life, despite knowing they'd driven me to it with their treatment. But learning that my father was only interested in reconciliation because he needed financial help crystallized something important for me. I wasn't responsible for fixing the consequences of their choices, just as they'd made it clear I couldn't count on them to support me when I needed it most. Freedom worked both ways. As winter gave way to spring in our second year, the property had been transformed into something I couldn't have imagined when I first walked those forest trails. The research station was hosting scientists from 3 different universities, studying everything from bird migration patterns to soil composition. The youth program had expanded to 12 residents, with a waiting list of young people hoping to join our community. Most importantly, we'd created something that mattered. Every day brought tangible evidence that our work was making a difference in the lives of the young people who'd found stability and purpose with us, in the scientific understanding of forest ecosystems, in the development of sustainable living practices that other communities were beginning to adopt. I'd also found personal happiness in ways I'd never expected. My relationship with Elena had evolved far beyond mentor and student. She'd completed her GED and was planning to study environmental science at the State University in the fall, but more than that, she'd become one of my closest friends. Her insights about resilience and recovery had taught me as much as anything I'd learned from textbooks or professional training. Marcus had become something like a younger brother to me, and his woodworking skills had expanded to include designing and building specialized equipment for our research programs. David's trail maintenance work had evolved into a comprehensive outdoor education program that attracted visitors from across the region. All of them had taught me that family doesn't have to be defined by blood relationships or legal documents. It can be chosen, built through shared values and mutual support and the daily decision to show up for each other. On the 2nd anniversary of my move to the military base, I stood on the front porch of my converted barracks home and looked out over the property as the sun set through the trees. The forest was alive with the sounds of early summer, birds calling to their mates, insects buzzing through the warm air, the distant laughter of residents gathered around the fire pit near the research station. 2 years earlier, I'd been a 28-year-old woman living in her childhood bedroom, working a job that slowly crushed her spirit, and desperately seeking approval from parents who saw her as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be valued. Now I was 30, financially independent, professionally fulfilled, and surrounded by a chosen family of people who appreciated me for exactly who I was rather than who they thought I should become. My father had been wrong about almost everything, but he'd been right about one thing. I had needed to learn to stand on my own feet. I just had to burn down everything he'd built for me in order to discover what I was actually capable of building for myself. The military base that he'd dismissed as worthless had become the foundation for the most meaningful work of my life. The environmental interests he'd mocked as tree-hugger nonsense had connected me with a community of scientists, educators, and activists who were tackling some of the most important challenges of our time. The independence he'd tried to deny me had allowed me to create something far more valuable than anything his real estate empire had ever produced. As I watched fireflies begin to flicker among the trees, I realized I hadn't thought about my parents in weeks. They'd become irrelevant to my daily happiness, their approval unnecessary for my sense of self-worth. The angry, hurt part of me that had driven the mansion sale had been replaced by something calmer and more constructive. The quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to my own values rather than someone else's expectations. I'd sold the mansion and left them with the military base, but in the end, I was the one who'd inherited everything that truly mattered. The chance to build something meaningful, the freedom to choose my own path, and the knowledge that I was far stronger and more capable than anyone had ever given me credit for. The burden my father had complained about carrying had turned out to be the gift I'd been waiting my entire life to give to the world. 3 months after that peaceful evening on my porch, an unexpected visitor arrived that would test everything I'd built and believed about my new life. I was in the research station, reviewing data from our latest wildlife survey with Dr. Whitman, when Marcus burst through the door with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of excitement and anxiety that immediately put me on alert. "Victoria, there's someone here to see you," he said, slightly out of breath from running across the property. "She says she's your mother." My stomach dropped. In 2.5 years, I'd successfully avoided any contact with my parents. The closest I'd come was Robert's report about my father's attempted reconciliation, which I'd dismissed without a second thought. But now, apparently, my mother had driven to the military base and was standing somewhere on my property. "Where is she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Near the main gate. She's been waiting for about 20 minutes. She looks..." Marcus paused, searching for the right word. "She looks different. Older, maybe? And she's driving this beat-up Honda instead of one of those fancy cars she used to have." Dr. Whitman gathered her papers discreetly. "I'll give you some privacy," she said, squeezing my shoulder supportively as she left. One of the things I valued most about my chosen family was their instinctive understanding of when to offer support and when to step back. I walked slowly toward the gate, my mind racing through possible explanations for this visit. Was my father ill? Had something happened to him? Or was this another attempt at reconciliation, this time using my mother as an intermediary, because they thought I might be more receptive to her approach? When I reached the gate, I barely recognized the woman standing beside the aging Honda Civic. This wasn't the perfectly coiffed Margaret Sterling who had hosted dinner parties and charity galas for 30 years. Her hair, once professionally styled twice a week, was streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain sweater instead of her usual designer outfits, and her face showed lines I'd never noticed before. But what struck me most was her posture. The confident, commanding presence that had intimidated me throughout my childhood was gone, replaced by something tentative and almost fragile. "Hello, Victoria," she said quietly when she saw me approaching. "Mom." The word felt strange in my mouth after so much time. "What are you doing here? I was hoping we could talk. I know you probably don't want to see me, but there are things I need to tell you. Things I should have said a long time ago." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but all I saw was exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine regret. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Robert Chen. I went to his office last week and begged him to tell me where you were. He refused at first, but She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I told him I was afraid I might not have much time left to make things right." This cryptic statement sent a chill through me. "What do you mean, you might not have much time?" She looked down at her hands, which I noticed were shaking slightly. "I've been having some health issues. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but it's made me realize that I've wasted too much time already on pride and stubbornness." "What kind of health issues? Early-stage Parkinson's disease?" "The doctors caught it relatively early, and the treatment options are much better than they used to be. But it's forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I've spent my life." The news hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything that had happened between us, she was still my mother, and the thought of her dealing with a serious illness alone was difficult to process. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "That must be frightening." "It is, but not as frightening as the realization that I've been a terrible mother to you, and I might run out of time to apologize for that." We stood in awkward silence for several moments before I made a decision that surprised me. "Would you like to see the property? I could show you what we've built here." Her face lit up with relief and gratitude. "I would love that." As we walked along the main trail, I found myself narrating the development of the conservation project and youth program. My mother listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about the research we were conducting and the young people we were helping. Her genuine interest was disorienting. I couldn't remember her ever showing such curiosity about my work or interests when I was younger. When we reached the research station, I introduced her to Elena, who was preparing specimens for a botanical study. My mother's interaction with Elena was warm and respectful, treating her like an adult with valuable contributions rather than a charity case to be pitied. "This is incredible," my mother said as we continued the tour. "I had no idea you were building something like this. Your father always made it sound like you were just hiding out in the woods, avoiding real responsibilities." "Is that what he told you?" She nodded, looking embarrassed. "I should have asked you directly instead of accepting his version of events. I should have done a lot of things differently." We ended up at my converted barracks home, where I made tea and we sat on the front porch as the afternoon light filtered through the trees. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had, honest, painful, and long overdue. "I need you to understand something," she said, staring into her teacup. "Your father and I, we didn't know how to be parents. We knew how to be successful according to the standards we'd grown up with, but we never learned how to actually nurture a child's individual spirit. That's not an excuse for how you treated me." "No, it's not. It's an explanation, but not an excuse. The way we handled your career choices, your interests, your entire personality, it was wrong. We tried to force you into a mold that was never going to fit, and when you resisted, we blamed you, instead of questioning whether we were asking the wrong things." She set down her teacup and looked directly at me. "The day your father called you a burden, I should have stood up for you. I should have told him he was wrong, and that you were our daughter, not an employee who could be dismissed when you didn't meet expectations. Instead, I sat there like a coward and let him destroy your sense of self-worth." "Why didn't you?" The question had haunted me for years. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of your father's anger, afraid of disrupting the life we'd built, afraid of admitting that we'd been wrong about so many things. I chose the easy path of maintaining the status quo instead of protecting my own daughter." The honesty was startling and painful, but also strangely healing. For the first time in my life, my mother was acknowledging the reality of our family dynamic instead of pretending everything had been perfect. "When you sold the mansion," she continued, "I was devastated. Not just because we lost our home, but because I realized how completely we'd failed as parents. You had to take such drastic action just to escape the damage we'd done." "What happened after I left?" Robert mentioned that Dad was having financial problems. Her laugh was bitter. "Financial problems are an understatement. Without the mansion as collateral, he couldn't get financing for his big development projects. Several deals fell through, and he had to close 2 of his satellite offices. But the real problem wasn't financial, it was psychological. Losing control over you, losing the house, it shattered his sense of himself as someone who could bend the world to his will." "And you? What happened to you?" "I had to get a job for the first time in 30 years. We're renting a small apartment now, and I work part-time at a local nonprofit that helps elderly people with transportation and meal services. It's been terrifying and humbling, but also liberating in a way I never expected." This revelation was almost as shocking as her Parkinson's diagnosis. My mother, who had never worked outside the home, who had built her entire identity around being Richard Sterling's wife, was now supporting herself through paid employment. "How do you feel about that?" "Proud, actually. I'm good at the work, and I'm helping people who really need assistance. It's given me a sense of purpose I never had when my only job was managing household staff and hosting dinner parties." We talked until the sun began to set, covering years of misunderstandings, missed opportunities, and mutual hurt. By the end of the conversation, I didn't feel ready to forgive everything or welcome her back into my life without reservations. But I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope that we might eventually build a different kind of relationship. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said as she prepared to leave. "I just needed you to know that I see you now. I see what you've accomplished, what you've built. the person you've become, despite everything we did wrong. You're extraordinary, Victoria, and I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize that. As I watched her drive away in her modest Honda, I realized that her visit had given me something I hadn't known I needed: closure with the past and permission to move forward without the weight of unresolved family trauma. The burden my father had complained about carrying had indeed turned out to be the gift I'd been waiting my entire life to give to the world. But it had also taught me that healing, like everything else worthwhile, happens on its own timeline and in its own way. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.